Okay, so far whatever we have seen is Python, and we are completed. We are done with Python, right? So the next step of our learning is like learning web development. Right. Today we will just go through and understand what are the fundamentals of web development. Right. What is a web development? What are the elements that come into the web development and the stuff on that. Right. Now, what is web development? What is web development? Anything. I mean, whatever you have learned, you can just tell what is a web development. Right. So any of that you see on the internet, right? So basically any website that you see, right, is being developed, is developed. So what is web development in general? So it is basically creating, right? It is basically creating, building websites. Yeah. So when you say website, it can, there are like, there are multiple things. So basically you will have to do programming. So web programming to manage website, right? Right. And database management, right? Web programming and also database management, right? So any website that you see today, so anything like, take Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, any of the website, maybe the some booking websites like Book My Show, or our APSRTC, or anything that you access over the internet is basically a website, right? So either it is a mobile app which is in behind the scenes talking to a website, or the web API, or it's a browser and basically going through something is basically a web development, right? So web development traditionally has two things, right? What are those? Right? What are those in the web development that we have? Right? It has two major parts, right? So there is something called front end. There is another thing called back end. Joining. If you see anybody joining, right, just kindly approve that. I will not be seeing it. Okay. Traditionally has something called front end and back end. Now, what is a front end and what is a back end? Any idea? Right. So if you open a browser, for example, let me share my, okay, I have already shared my screen. So the browser is not visible, right? Is it visible now? The browser?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So now whatever you see in the browser, whatever you see, the visual representation here, right, is the front end, the visual representation. You will basically interact through the browser, right? It is front end. It is the one which is facing the user. If you are a user, this UI is what you are seeing, and you click here, you type something, you search, right? So this is what you do generally. So then you have something called YouTube, right? So basically you'll have so many things, right? So This is the front end, right, where the number of videos are being listed here, and then you have several options where you can click and surf through, right? And whatever user interacts with directly is through the browser, and this is the front facing for a user, and hence it is called front end. Are we clear?
Clear.
Right? And how is front end developed? This particular whatever browser that you just saw is developed using technologies like any idea? Okay, okay, right. So the front end technologies are you have HTML, you have CSS, and you have JavaScript, right? So these are used to develop the front end applications, right? And there are certain frameworks like Angular, right? Or React, right? Or Vue.js, right? There are different other frameworks which help us to build the front end applications, right? And you can the front end you can also consider mobile application also, mobile interface. That is also front facing to the user, and that can also be considered as a front end, right? We know what is HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Do we know? Right? So these are the technologies used to build a HTML page, which you can see in the browser. Okay. I have already told you, like, kindly go through this. Please do not ignore and go through this. Okay. And the next thing is we have backend. We have. So this is all the user is facing, and this is the backend, meaning user doesn't know what is there in the backend. User doesn't know what is there in the backend. And this course is mostly for the backend, right? So this course is a Python with a backend development. Python with backend development. Now, when it comes to backend, what are the different technologies that we use? Right? Backend has several technologies, right? Say Java, right? And then Python, right? Then you have PHP, then you have Ruby. These are all different programming languages, which there are a lot. Okay, there are a lot. There are different other programming languages, right? Right. The under Python, under Java, like, you have something called Spring is the famous web development framework, right? And under Python, there are two major web development frameworks, which is Flask, another one is Django. Another one is Django. As part of this course, we will be going through Flask. We'll be going through Flask. And once after you build a web application, right? So the front end is there, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and again you have your backend, either Java, Python, PHP. This is the programming language, right? In the backend, there is another thing is which we should talk about is storage, right? Where you have to store your data somewhere, right? So as part of the storage, you have several databases, right? So you have MySQL, you have PostgreSQL, right? As part of this course, we will be using PostgreSQL. Okay, right? So in order to do the backend frameworks, we'll be using, right? In order to do the backend development, we'll be using Python along with the Flask, along with the PostgreSQL, right? Are we clear?
Clear, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Clear, sir.
Now, as I told, there is something called front end, right? Which you can traditionally open in the browser, and then you can check for that data. And that is basically visible in the user desktop, user desktop. And what is the other thing? So this is the front end. Then you have your backend. Your backend is somewhere in the cloud, somewhere in the cloud. So either you might be using Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, or wherever. What is a cloud in general? What is cloud? You must have heard the term called cloud, right? Cloud meaning, right, when you access a certain website. How do you access a particular website? How do you access a website? How do you access a website in general?
We can go through username, password.
No, but before going to username, how do you access that username password page?
By creating an account.
But how do you create? How do you know where to create an account? You should somehow reach to that page how you can create an account, right? Right? There is something called URL. Do you know what is a URL?
Yes, sir.
What does that mean?
Uniform resource locator.
Uniform resource locator. For example, you will type this is your URL. So you have multiple pieces here. First, there is a piece here. Then there is a piece here. And then you have, right. What does this mean? What does this mean? And what does this mean? Protocol, right? HTTP or HTTPS, right? HTTPS means it is secured, meaning everything, every data that is transferred over the HTTPS network is encrypted. Right? Nobody can, hackers cannot easily get into the HTTPS network and see what is happening. So they can always crack it, but always HTTPS is more secure way. It is all encrypted. Okay, this www is basically called, this entire thing is called domain. Okay, and these are subdomains. Right, www dot is basically a subdomain, and this entire thing is called domain, and google.com is also a domain. Okay, right. So in this, what does HTTP mean? Hypertext transfer protocol.
Protocol, sir.
Hypertext transfer protocol. S means secure. S means secure. So basically, when you go on a browser and type something, by default, it takes HTTP. And there is, when you type this, right, when this is basically your URL, right, it first goes to something called DNS. Any idea what is DNS? It is called domain name server. It is called domain name server. Okay. Now for this URL, there will be a so URLs. So eventually, right, your backend should run on a particular computer. Your backend should run on a computer, right? Your backend should have things like there is a motherboard, there is a RAM, there is a CPU, there is a hard disk. Whenever you want to run a program, you need all of this, right? And that is how you are running stuff on your laptop. So because your laptop has all of this, yes, you are able to run, see whatever you want, right? That is there. At the same time, so if you want to access facebook.com or instagram.com, which means this particular code, either it is a backend code, either it is a Java, PHP, Python, whatever it is, right? That particular code should be running somewhere. That code should be running somewhere, right? So that is where it would be running somewhere in the cloud, because cloud is whenever it is not your computer and you are going to some other computer, right? Through internet, right? And it is hosted on either AWS, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud, or DigitalOcean, wherever it is being deployed into someone else's computer. When your code is running on someone else's computer means not always like, it is not always mean there is a desktop, there is a laptop. No, it can be a physical server somewhere in the system, which is just the CPU, hard disk, and RAM and stuff like this is the motherboard. With this components, it can be just a physical server running somewhere, and which is not yours, and which is not yours. You can treat that as a cloud, right? You can treat that as a cloud. Right. So you, as I was coming talking, so when you open your browser, right, you type www.google.com on your browser, you see a Google page, right? So there is a search bar and stuff like this. You can type something here and you can click on search. Now, typically what happens is this server where your backend code is running, right, will not know what is google.com. It will be running on a particular IP address. 245.162.1.256 or something like that. There is a IP address. There is a IP address. Right? There is a IP address where your backend is running on. Right? This is the IP address means what? To uniquely identify a particular server in the internet, you need IP address. This is like, just like home address, you have an address to your home, right? So on so and so location, on so and so street, on so and so line, on so and so house number, and so person. That is your address. That is your address. Say Andhra Pradesh, then follows by Anantapur, follows by certain street, follows by certain line, followed by certain house number. In that house, there are several people living, and you have your name. So I can easily identify who you are. If I want to tell me your address, can you give me with that? By which anybody can come to your house and identify you? Yes or no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. In the same way, any service that is running on an internet need an address. If you know an address, you can reach to that server. For example, the address that we know is google.com. That we know is google.com. The moment you type google.com, and how does the server's actual address is the IP address. Actual address for the server is IP address, not this domain name. Actual address is a IP address. Right now, Google servers are running, and this is the IP address of those server example, right? And if you is it which is easy to remember, google.com or 245.162.1.256, which is easy to remember,
Google.com, sir.
Google.com, sir.
right? And Instagram.com, Facebook.com, YouTube.com. If at all, if there is no domain name and just the IP addresses, it will be like very hard for people to remember it itself. Right? People should be able to easily access the backend services. They don't need the IP addresses. So that is why people get, the technology, we use something called domain name. That way I can directly reach to, and what happens is you type the domain name and there is something in between. There is something called DNS servers, right? Where there is a URL versus IP address. We don't maintain it. So as a developer, you don't have to worry about this, but there is somebody is maintaining. Google.com means there is this IP address. Facebook.com means this IP address. YouTube means this IP address. Somebody is maintaining that. We don't notice that generally. The moment you type google.com in browser, it first goes to the domain name server, and from there gets the IP address, and from there it goes to that particular IP address through the internet. It finds the right server, and that server responds with the page. That server responds with the page. For example, right? So let me just right click on your browser. You will have something called inspect. You will have something called inspect. Just click on that. Okay. And once you click on that, so you will get something like this. Okay. And if you go to the network tab here, if you go to the network tab here, you can see what are the requests that are going. So I'm just going to shift it down so that I can easily show you guys. Right. You have, right, you can see all the requests that are going here. Okay, for example, let me just say preserve log, clear everything from here, and just type google.com. Right. So if you see, right, I have typed google.com. So this is my request. This is my request, right, in the browser. Right. If you see here, so our request URL is what? HTTPS www.google.com. And it is a GET request. It is what kind of request? GET request. I'm just asking to get me this thing. And if you see, right, so do you see that address here? 2404. This is IPv6 address. Generally, there are two kinds of in IP address formats, IPv4 and IPv6. So this is the IPv6 format. And if you see, there is a port number as well. What is the port number here? 443. Right. So this is your DNS URL, but actually the remote address is this is the IP address of that. This is the IP address of the Google server. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
sir.
Right. As a response, you got this page. As a response, you got HTML back. You requested for a certain domain, and that resolved to an IP address. It went to the Google server and got this HTML as a response to you. Got this HTML as a response back to the browser. And who can understand this HTML? It is your browser which can understand the HTML. And once you have the HTML, now Google, your browser understands this HTML. This is all basically HTML. Okay. This is all basically your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all of that, right? And your browser understands whatever the server has sent, and this is how it is showing. This is the response. Whatever you seeing this page, right? That is the response for you. That is the response for you. For example, let me just go to APS RTC. Right, let me just find the website. Now this is my web address. This is the web address. Again, let me just click on inspect, go to the network tab. Yeah. And let me clear everything and reload. Right. So this is the first link. Right. This is the URL that I requested for. And this is the IP address that it has resolved to. Right. This is IPv4 format. Now, if I just copy this IP address instead of that, and go to the browser. Okay, for it is a 403 request could not be satisfied. CloudFront is not giving the data. That is fine. Right. So this is a CloudFront setting. So we are basically cannot access it with the IP address, but with the domain, it resolves to the IP address. And with the IP address, right, it will fetch the response, right? Whatever is the response, and it would have returned this HTML structure, whatever you're seeing here. And that HTML is basically displayed here in the UI. Displayed you in the UI. UI means user interface. User interface. Whatever you can see in the browser right now is a response based on this URL. Based on this URL. Are we clear? Now, when I type this URL, there should be someone who is giving this response. Yes, once after I have received that response, we are able to see this beautiful user representative, beautiful representation of the data here in the UI. Right now, thus building of this particular web page, we use HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a proper front-end data. And now who gave this data and who is giving this data? For example, if I just select, say, from Bangalore, right, to Hyderabad, right? And let me just say click today. So these are all development is front end. The moment I say check availability, let me just open and go back to the network tab. The moment I say check availability, right, you can see that there would be a request that goes to the backend. That goes to a backend, right? So that goes to a backend. What is the data that we have sent? What is the data that we have sent? Right? I said, right? Source Bangalore, destination is Hyderabad. So we are sending this data, and what is the journey date? 28/8/2023, right? So we are sending this data from the front end. It goes to the back end, and back end responds back with all the data. So if you see here, right? So JSON data, right? There is something called JSON here, right? So if you see, these are all the pickup points of a particular bus, right? What is the bus number and all of this is all the data that you can basically see here, right? 6436341 as a service, and you will have all of that data sent by the backend to the front end. Okay, now front end takes that data and starts in your browser starts showing that data here. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear, sir.
Right? Which means if I go back here, so your domain name server gives an IP address. Now you have your server. Now the server can be, say, let us say it is running in Python. It is running on Python as a backend language is Python, and there is a particular database, right? Where, see, now backend is just a programming language. Python is just a programming language. It basically runs a certain program. But where is the data stored? Data stored in a database, right? Right. Data is stored in a database, which is PostgreSQL, Let us say, as I told, there are different databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle DB, Elasticsearch. There are a lot of databases, but the one which we would be using is PostgreSQL, and the backend language that we have chosen is Python. And in order to develop a web application, you need a certain framework where you can run your web service, For that, we are using Flask. Right? So our backend design for the backend architecture, what are we have selected? We have selected Python as a programming language, PostgreSQL as a database engine, and for a web framework, we are using Flask. Okay, are we clear? Now, when a
Yes.
particular request is made, the request is basically received through your Python code, which is through the Flask web framework. Now, Flask talks to your database. Give me the data buses today from Bangalore to Hyderabad. Where is that stored? That is stored in the database. And that database returns certain response that is basically taken care by your web framework. And that web framework returns the respective data back to the browser. Browser gets that data is when you can see your data populated in the UI. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear, sir.
Right. Let's see. To log in. Just give it a moment. Right, you see, these are all the data that I hold. These are all the data that I hold. Right. So if you see, there are a lot of things that is happening here. Okay. So, but if I just click on this, maybe this is this and click on it. Right. So this is the URL that I requested for. This is the URL that I requested for. Always there will be, this is the domain address. This is the domain linkedin.com, but behind that there is an IP address and there is a particular port number on which the service is running. on which the service is running, and browser would send quite a lot of data to the backend. It has to validate whether it is a browser, a valid data or a not, right? So basically backend returns certain HTML, backend returns certain HTML, and that HTML is basically plotted here in the UI. Okay, and that is for requesting the initial HTML and all. You can also write queries to get more data, to get the data as well. So preview, right? So these are all JSON. Now who is giving this response? Your backend is giving this response. Your backend is giving this response. This is basically given in the form of a JSON structure, and which you can use which you can use to represent the data here in the UI. Okay, so this is all dynamic data. This is all dynamic data, right? So there are a lot of things that comes into play when we talk about web development. When we talk about web development, right? Well, we know do we have a clear understanding of what is a web development now, and what is the front end, what is the back end, what is the purpose of a front end, and what is the purpose of back end? Do we have a clarity?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right now, remember, when you're running a PostgreSQL service, it always also needs, as I told, what are the different things that it requires, right? DB name and all of that. And primarily it requires as a port number and also IP address where it is running. IP address is nothing but host in your PostgreSQL. You remember we have done this, right? So by default, 127.0.0.1 is the local IP address, and default port number is 5432. For every service, right? For every service that is running on internet has a particular IP address, and there is a port number to it. There is a port number to it. Now you can treat if so every service that is running. So even now, if we have to start developing our web application, we also need two important things, right? The IP address and where the service is running, right? And what is the port number in your laptop? For example, if you take your laptop right now, how many services would be running in your laptop? Right, you will basically run
Multiple,
browser,
sir.
right? Multiple processes. You're running a browser. You can simultaneously open a game, right? You can simultaneously open any VLC player. You can open Excel, open a doc, right? You can open multiple at the same time. You can open multiple things. Right now, every service is running within your own laptop. Within your laptop, these are the services that are running, right? And how does your computer know which service? How does it uniquely identify the service? So whenever a service is running, it will start. Though now within the service, the IP address is always same, 127.0.0.1, which means it is local, which is local as in within your computer. And how does it differentiate between each service? Then each service runs on a specific port number. Two services cannot use the same port number. Two services cannot use same port number. Every service should have a unique port number. Let us say if this has 1234, this has to have 1235, and this has to have 1236. And no two services cannot have the same IP address. So this and this has the same IP address. So if this has started first, this will run. And if this is starting next, then we will say it will not. Okay, this port is already taken. Use a different port is what it will tell. Right? Two services cannot have a same port number. Every service will have, right? It should have a unique port number. That way, we can easily identify each of the service uniquely. So your IP address colon port number is basically the unique address in the internet. Okay. So if I have to like tell in a normal, a simple example. So for example, if you take an address, right? So there is a apartment. There is a apartment. In apartment, typically how many people would live? Say 100 houses. Say 100 houses. Now, if you say address, now this apartment team name is like say uh, uh, um, like Python apartment. The name of this apartment is Python apartment. Now, when you give an address, you say where do you live? You will say Python apartment, right? And people will come here. And now in this apartment, there are 100 families or 100 houses. And how do they identify your house? How do they identify your house? Every house has a unique
Door
number,
number.
right? Every house has a unique number. Let us say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you live in the seventh house. You live in the seventh house. Now, how do you say, okay, if this Python apartment is your IP address, right? Your house number is the port number. Your house number is the port number. So for everybody outside, what would you say? What is your where do you live? Oh, I live in Python apartment. Right? And I particularly live in seventh house. I particularly live in seventh house, which means your apartment can be treated as an IP address and the house number can be treated as a port number. Are we clear? That way, you can anybody can easily identify the same, uniquely easily identify your address specifically. In the same way, in a computer or in any system, there will be multiple services that would be running, and all of these services will have the same IP address. But if you have to uniquely identify each of the servers, then each of the servers should have a unique port number, should have a unique port number. Are we clear?
Clear, sir.
Clear, sir.
Yes, sir.
Clear, sir.
Right? Okay. So this is one level. So always remember your front end talks to back end to get the data. And backend will always have two things. One is primary, a programming language on which your application runs. A programming language can be Python, and Python directly cannot run. It needs to have a web framework. Here we'll be using something as Flask. A Flask cannot store data, or a language cannot store data. So in order to store data, we use something called a DB, and there are several databases. In that, the database that we are going to use is PostgreSQL. Clear?
Clear, sir.
Always front
Yes,
end
sir.
asks
Yes,
for
sir.
the backend to give the data, and backend responds with the data. Backend responds with the data. Okay. Now this communication over the internet, over the internet always uses a protocol called HTTP. Always uses a protocol called HTTP. Okay. Now what is HTTP? We have already seen hypertext transfer protocol. Right? And now generally, if two people are talking, right? If person one is talking to person two, if person one is talking to a person two, right? So he will ask a question and this guy will respond, right? There is a communication happening between two people, person one, person two. Okay. And let us say there is a person three. We will get the person three later into the picture. But yeah, so when a person one is talking of person two, he will say, what is your name? What is your name? Let us say this guy responds with the name as Leo. Okay, so this is basically you have asked the question and that question has reached to the person one, and person one has asked a question and it has reached a question has reached to the person two, right? And person two has responded and that response has been reached to the person one. Yes. Now Person 2 has understood that question first, processed this, understood that question, right? Checked his memory and responded with this data. In the same way, browser, there is a computer 1 talking to another computer 2. Your typically your phone is also a computer. It does have a CPU, it does have a memory, it does have storage, it does have CPU. So it all has everything that a regular computer has. Now in internet, when it comes to that, there is a computer talking to a computer. Computer talking to a computer. So in humans, when we talk, right? So basically we have certain sense. We understand, we see the people, we understand, and we answer. And we answer. Now, when computer 1 is talking to a computer, they're not people. They don't have that intelligence. This they are intelligent when you program. But how do you introduce yourself? I know that by looking at your face, I know this is Momin, right? This is Mohammed. Now, when they know each other, so right, there is a person talking to another person. You are visually you can see these two people, right? A person 1 can see person 2 can see person 1, and they know, they trust each other, they can happily communicate. But when a computer 1 is talking to a computer 2 via the internet, how do they understand? Okay, this guy will say I am a computer 1, so basically I'll say okay, this is my IP address. And now this guy will, and if he understands that IP address and if he understands that user, then he will respond back with a respective data. If he doesn't understand, then he will say, okay, boss, I don't understand who you are, right? Now, for example, here, this person 3 asks, okay, what is your password? What is your phone password? Right? Do you just answer if somebody asks you what is your phone password? Like you will be walking on a road, walking on a street. Okay, some random person will ask for your phone and they say, give me your password, tell me your password. Will you just tell your password to him?
No, sir.
No, right? So you will not tell,
No,
okay,
sir.
boss, why should I tell you? I will not tell you, right? Which means you're not authorized to access my personal data. For example, let us say your brother or your sister, they will take your phone and they'll ask you like, bro, can you tell me the password? I want to call someone. Will you give the password or not? Right? Based on the trust. If you trust the other person, you give the password. If you don't trust the other person, you don't give the password. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right? Now, in the same way, when two computers are talking to each other, they need to trust each other. They need to trust each other that, okay, should how do I know that this is a, because these are like totally black box. This is somewhere in Bangalore. Let us say the other person is, the other services, other computer is somewhere in London, right? But from here you can just access, right? You can access data because you have internet. You can access any IP address, any URL from anywhere in the world, and you can get the data. Perfect, right? Now when two computers need to trust each other, that is where a thing called authentication comes into the picture. Right? Authentication means you have to authenticate that I'm so and so user. That is why you have a page called login. What do? You enter your username and you enter your password, and your browser sends it to the backend. Okay, then backend checks, okay, is it the right username? Is it the right password? Is it the correct thing? Once it is validated, okay, now your backend, another computer knows, okay, he's so and so user. If the data is valid, then the other computer, okay, this guy is so and so user, and I have to respond with a particular data. That is when you get your own response, right? So this process of you giving out your information to tell the other computer that I'm so and so is basically called as authentication. Is basically called as authentication. Based on your right username and password, that other computer will trust. Okay, boss. Okay, I know who you are. I'll give you your data. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
This is typically like,
Yes, sir.
when your dad calls you up and tells, okay, this guy named with this guy name and then John is going to come to you. You give your car keys to him. Example. Okay. Now after an hour, somebody comes to you and asks for a car key. You will not directly give you, right? Give the car keys to him. You'll ask, okay, what is your name? He says John. Okay, then it may, which means your dad had told John, and this guy's name is also John. Now, John. Now you authenticate. Okay, so this is a valid data. So I'm going to give a car key. In the same way, when we send a certain username and password to the backend from the front end, right? The backend would where would have we stored this information? This would be somewhere in the database. This username, this password. I will check. Okay, the is this username valid? And is the password valid for this username? And if they both match with the data that is stored in the database, then which means, okay, this is a valid user, this is a valid password, and they are matching, and hence you know that is a genuine request, and then you respond with the appropriate response back to the front end on which is displayed to the user. Right? And now when two computers are talking, they just talk in two languages, right? Either there is a HTML that is sent, or there is a XML that is sent, or there is JSON. Okay. Whenever they send this particular data, either HTML, XML, or JSON. Okay, let us say three languages the browser can understand. Right, when it sends this particular data format, which obviously your browser uses this to represent or show that in the UI, right? And they also have different status codes. There are different status codes from on which browser understands. Okay, the what the first browser looks at the status codes and then looks at the response. So there are different status codes. What are these called? HTTP status codes. HTTP status codes. It's basically a code first. Okay, if it is a successful response, there is a number called 200 for all the successful responses. Okay, there is something called 404, which means page not found. Okay, the URL that you're looking for is not there, right? If someone comes to your home and asks, okay, do you have John Abram in your house? Okay, if there is a person, you would say yes, he is the person. You say, right? Then you, which means the response is 200. If that person is not there in your house, okay, this is a wrong address. You will tell, right? This wrong address is nothing but 404 in the web. Okay, and there is something called 403, which means you don't have, if someone comes and like, asks for a password for you, and you will say like, boss, I'm not going to give it to you, I don't know who you are, I don't have a trust on you, which means 403, unauthorized. 403 means unauthorized. In the same way, there are several status codes. There are several HTTP status codes. You can just Google through them. There are several status codes, right? Anything 200 is a successful, 300 is a 3xx, meaning 300 unchanged, redirection, 400 client error, 500 server error, 500 server error. So you can just go read about this, right? So status codes are issued by the server in response to a client request. Client, when I say client, it is basically the front end. The browser is a client, right? It requests for certain data and server responds along with the data. Every time server also responds with data as well as the status code, data as well as the status code. Browser, you first reads the status code. If it is 200, it does certain operation and so on, right? Right, 400 is a bad request, 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden. Forbidden means you're not allowed to access this data. 404 not found, right? 405 method not allowed. So for as a programmer, it is not necessary that you should always by heart these things, but you should know that there are a few known status codes, which is 200, 404, 403, 401, right? 500, 504, 508, okay, 504, 503, 502, right? 508 we don't usually use, but yeah, 502, 500 does meaning some error. If there is any unhandled error in your code, for example, it just crashes. And when the app stops, right, that is when you get, 500 internal server error. And if the service is not running, it will take 502 bad gateway or 503 service unavailable, right? So this, there are, for every error there is a status code and there is a respective meaning to it. There is a status code and there is a respective meaning to each of the status code. And whenever we are communicating between the server to the front end, which is the server to the client, right? So it talks in the this HTTP protocol. So either one, it will always, for every request, there will be a response, which is the data. Along with that, there will be status code as well. Along with that, there will be a status code as well. So for example, this is the response headers, right? And okay, let me just show this to you rather than this. Right, what is the status code? This is the request URL and the status code is 200. I mean, we got the status code as 200, which means it is a successful response. Which means it is a successful response. In the same way, there are several other responses, right? So you have to understand each of this response, not necessarily that you have to by heart them, but at least know what is what, right? Just go through that once, right? But the major primary ones are 200, 401, 403, 500, 502, 503, and 404. If you just remember these few things and their meaning, then you are good to go. Are we clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear, sir.
Right,
Yes,
there are
sir.
several status codes and I want you to just go through them. Okay, this is the very, very fundamental and basics that you should know before starting with the web development, And tomorrow we will start our first starting our first journey to the building the web application development. Tomorrow we will start building a very, very basic application and we'll keep proceed further by learning the different functions methods that are there in the web development, which is the in the Flask framework, and try to build and extend our web application as we go further. So by the probably next 10 classes, you would be done, right? We would have done, we would have built a web application and we would be done by the with the course as well. Okay, so from now on, I want you to be like, very, very, very attentive and very clear and what is asked and you should know like everything. You have to practice a lot, right? There is no way around as we go further. All right.
Yes,
That's it for
sir.
the class today, unless you have questions.